So I am excited and delighted to introduce to you Dr. Shannon Offenbach. She is an assistant professor with us in the WAMI program and teaches in one of the first blocks, which is the MCBD block. She is also our lead for academic support coordination. This is a key position for incoming students as they enter medical school, and in many cases have to rapidly sort of transition from a traditional undergraduate lecture-based curriculum to a very dense and intense curriculum delivered in a flipped classroom model in a very compressed period of time. Some people refer to it, and I think the PA program referred to it earlier, as drinking from a fire hose. What is typically taught in a semester can be taught in 3 or 4 weeks. So she will be talking to you a little bit about study skills and learning strategies, which are applicable to undergraduate as well as to graduate work. Dr. Offenbach.
Hello, everyone. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share screen. Make sure this is... All right, can everybody see that? That's a yes. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about evidence-based study, and that will hopefully help you get an idea of what effective learning is for you and how to make you more effective. My goal is that if I reach out to you now before you become medical students, my job when you actually get here will be that much easier. So I have some internal motivation for this type of talk. All right, so to start off with, I wanted to start with talking about how learning is misunderstood. And we've all been learning for most of our lives, right? And you'd think we'd be really good at this since we've been doing it most of our life. But it seems that once we hit school and once we hit this more complicated learning and this more structured learning environment, you know, our ideas of what learning is about might be a little off. And this is, I put this very provocative statement up here. Is our intuition the enemy of teaching and learning? And this is, there's a chapter that talks about this in this chapter is taken from the Understanding How We Learn. It's a visual guide for learning, and it's in the resource section that we'll talk about later. But the whole idea is that sometimes the things that make our feelings and our impressions of our learning is not exactly accurate. And I'm going to look at this from two different lenses. The first is kind of the learner standpoint, and that's, you know, you as a learner. You know, first we want to use study methods that make us feel smart, right? And so when we're doing something and it's hard and it's difficult, we tend to back off because we don't, it doesn't make us feel good. When we're doing things that are hard, it makes us feel like maybe we aren't very smart or maybe we aren't very good at it, especially if as most of us we're kind of indoctrinated into a fixed mindset, which tells us that if we aren't instantly good at something, or if something doesn't come easy, that we're not good at it. And that's not really true, because what we do know is that really good learning comes from effort. And we'll talk more about that as we go on. We also tend to be tricked by illusions of knowing. And a good example of that is you know, how often do we pick up a textbook and we read the chapter? And then when we go back and study later, we pick up that chapter and we start to read it and we go, yep, I remember that. Yep, I remember that. And it makes us feel good because we recognize the language from that textbook because we've already looked at it once, right? We've already read it once, and it makes us feel good. It makes us feel confident. We're like, yeah, we get that, we get that. The problem is that we have this illusion of knowing, which means that we recognize the verbiage, but we don't necessarily have a better grasp of that knowledge because we reread it again. What actually gives us a better grasp of the knowledge is if we've actually practiced applying the knowledge, or if we've had deeper conversations or thoughts, or if we've elaborated on it by talking to others or looking for specific examples or these multiple different mechanisms that we have. And we'll talk about all these as the talk goes on, but But I think you get the gist. If you're just rereading something, we get this illusion of knowing something that maybe we don't know as well as we think. Furthermore, I also wanted to look at this from an educational learning standpoint. So this is kind of our systematic learning and education in general. And for one, instructor feedback comes from students. So as instructors, we know or we've been taught that quizzing students frequently actually leads to better learning. However, if you notice, a lot of instructors are hesitant to give you a quiz every class period. And why is that? We know that it would actually help your learning if we gave you a quiz every class period. But we also know that we might not get the best reviews, or students might not be happy. They might not want to take our class because of the stress of having these exams or these quizzes every week. And so that comes into play sometimes in the fact that we don't always use the most effective methods of teaching even. There's also a lot of disconnect between what we know from cognitive research and educational theory and practice. And, you know, an example that I'm going to give you here are learning types. We've all heard of learning types, that some of us are visual learners, or some of us are auditory learners, or these. And what we really know is that there's absolutely no cognitive research data that supports learning types. In fact, there have been countless and countless attempts to try to actually demonstrate that these learning type or learning preferences exist, and they don't, or at least we can't show that they do. And yet this is kind of this concept that we all have a specific learning example is perpetuated throughout time, and it comes from the fact that what really happened is that, you know, there was some fabulous teacher at some point that said, wow, you know, if I teach in these different modalities, then my students do better. And, you know, sure enough, other teachers started doing it. And then sure, all these students were doing better when they were taught this information in different modalities. But from a cognitive research standpoint, we can't isolate that it was actually the modalities that was helping. And in fact, we've come to conclude that it was probably the fact that we were getting spaced repetition, which we'll talk about in a little bit, using these different modalities. So we saw, you know, the teacher would explain something verbally, and then she would come back and give something in written form, and then come back and have students write things so that they could actually use a different modality again. And in fact, the students were getting multiple passes of the same material, and we think that that's probably why those particular learning style techniques were actually so successful. So now hopefully, what I really want you to take away from this is that learning is effortful. And if you find that you are doing something, if you are learning and things are coming easy, you might want to step back and ask yourself, am I actually giving myself the illusion of knowledge versus doing something difficult? And then we'll go a little bit into research as well. So going to the next slide, I've kind of added, and if we were all in person, I'd have you raise hands at which of these techniques you prefer and which ones you use. And instead, you know, that's a little hard to do in this setting. So what I'm really going to do is I'm going to ask that you kind of think about these techniques as we go through and whether they're ones that you use. And I'm going to change this so that I can actually draw. But, you know, how many of you enjoy rereading your textbook? You know, we already talked about that, and you know, I've talked about the fact that kind of gives us this illusion of knowledge. You know, what about flashcards? How many of you like to use flashcards? Flashcards are fabulous, actually. They're great learning because they're going to give you, it's going to make things difficult because you have to reach back in your own memory to try to bring up the topics that you're talking about. And flashcards really kind of give at what I'm going to talk about is the foundational of learning, or that's kind of the basis for our learning. It's the foundational knowledge. So what about rewatching lecture videos? How great of a strategy is that? Well, I'll let you guess, but it's similar to rereading your textbook. it's going to give you this illusion of knowledge because you're just intaking information again. You're just intaking the same information. You aren't challenging yourself. You aren't trying to look at things through a new perspective. It's the exact same information coming in the exact same way. How about studying with a partner? Well, you can do kind of basic knowledge like flashcards with a partner, and that's going to give you foundational learning. However, if you work with a partner and really push each other to understand bigger concepts and to get a better understanding of bigger concepts, then that can also give you an applicational understanding, which is even one step up from this foundational learning. You know, foundational learning is just kind of where you're learning the basics for what you need to know. And then the next level is understanding and being able to apply and you know, hypothesize about that information. And so studying with a partner is really good because it gives you this applicational. Rereading highlighted text or highlighting when you're texting. You know, we all do it. And you know, finding something in a highlighted text if you're looking for a specific piece of information can be helpful. That part's helpful. But actually going back and studying just the re-highlighted text, once again, is going to contribute to an illusion of knowledge. What about self-quizzing, asking yourself questions? Self-quizzing is fantastic. You know, it helps with your foundational learning. But depending on the type of questions you're asking, it can also help you with your applicational understanding. Rereading notes, once again, you know, the part of rereading is going to clue you in that that's an illusion of knowledge. Studying per your learning style. We've already kind of talked about that misconception. How about concept mapping, drawing things out, trying to put whatever you're learning into a basic concept map. You know, it does a little bit of both. It can help teach your foundational learning, especially if you try to rebuild your concept maps from memory, and we'll talk about that later as well. And it also gives you the applicational understanding. All right, and finally the last thing, and you know, hopefully you guys are all far better students than I was, but you know, I remember looking at textbooks and wondering why the authors had always put so much effort into putting questions at the end of the chapter, because I didn't know anybody that actually looked at those questions. And sadly, that probably gives you a clue as to how strong of a student I was, at least earlier on. But you know, the questions at the end of the chapter, they're fabulous, because what they're really getting at is they are asking the hard questions to make sure that you are getting the applicational understanding. And so a lot of us tend to avoid those questions at the end of the chapter because they make you stretch your knowledge, and they make you reach for that applicational understanding. And so they're really, sometimes those questions are really hard. And as we talked about, you know, we don't really like to do those hard things because they make us feel like we aren't good at it. So, you know, if you have found yourself skipping the questions at the back of the chapter, well, maybe you should relook at that and rethink that. One of the things that that I also used to do, or is a bad habit to get into, is you look at the question and you think vaguely, oh, I get that, without really actually making yourself say the answer out loud or writing it down. Really try to make yourself write it out down, because you can kind of convince yourself that your vague understanding makes sense. But when you actually have to put it into concrete words on paper, you'll find that maybe your understanding isn't as concrete as what you thought. All right, so that's enough of that activity. Let's talk a little bit about the general learning process. So you have information, and that information comes at you from a variety of things, and really it's from your senses. And so, you know, it's from your hearing, it's from your sight, it's from your taste, it's from your feeling, it's from your movement, it's all these things, and in your brain then encodes that information into your short-term memory. And that short-term memory, from there, lots of things can happen. First, it can get trashed, and this is a great thing. You know, we tend to think of, you know, us losing our memory is a bad thing, but actually, you know, we really have to cull a lot of information. I don't need to know where I left my keys, you know, last week. I would like to remember where I left my keys today, and actually in quarantine, you know, that kind of blurs a little bit, but you get the idea, right? You don't need to hold on to that information for forever, and so it would just clog up space if we did. But what the short-term memory can also do then is if we're using it frequently, if we use that short-term memory and we determine, or something in our brain determines that it's going to be useful in the future, it provides its relevance, then it's either going to be consolidated, which brings it into long-term memory, or it goes into our working memory. And this can happen when you're working through a problem set. So if you've read the chapter, and then you start doing the questions at the end, and you're bringing those things that you just brought into your short-term memory into your working memory and are kind of using them as you're puzzling through those questions and thinking about it, then it's more likely that that working memory is going to get converted, or that short-term memory is going to be then later put into, you know, your recall and or your reconsolidation or basic consolidation. So depending on what you're doing with the information is going to determine whether it actually makes it into long-term memory. Now, long-term memories can also get junked after a while, or we kind of lose the ability to access them. And how we can make those memory traces stronger is we can recall them. And when we recall them, we bring them into our working memory, we think about them, and then they get reconsolidated again. And this recall and reconsolidation, it does two things. It makes our memory traces stronger. It can also connect different memory traces. And so let's think about this. I have this analogy that I really like, and this is a map analogy for building memory traces. You want your memory traces to be built, and here's what a real image of neurons working together looks like. And you can see it's not a whole lot different than this map of Tacoma in Seattle area. And what you want your memories to look like is this Tacoma Seattle map, right? You want there to be these huge freeways, which are your memory traces, and you want them to be connected to all of these other, because that way, you know, if you remember Olympia, or if you make it to Olympia, then your odds of being able to get Tacoma and to find Tacoma is a lot easier, right? Whereas if your memory looks more like Glenwood down here, you're going to have a harder time finding it. You're going to have a very specific way. You have to take this very specific road to get to that memory. Meanwhile, Golden View over here is a little different. You know, it's harder to get to, but we can access it from a few different points. And so you can see that there's this variety. So when you are thinking about learning and you've got some kind of memory that you're really trying to access, the more that you can connect it to other thoughts and other access points, and the more times you can remember it, the stronger the memory traces and the more connected it'll be, the easier it is for you to find it when you need it. Okay, so now this brings us to the 6 evidence-based learning strategies that are kind of the heart of this talk. And they're actually kind of chosen from this group called the Learning Scientists, and they're cognitive researchers that are kind of making it their goal to make learning or cognitive research more accessible to educators and students alike. And so they've made it this kind of easy way to remember, and they've gone through all the cognitive research and done a lot of looking at what's really effective. And these are the 6 kind of pieces that we know work really well based on cognitive research. And there's retrieval practice, and we'll talk about all these. I'm just going to give you what they're named first. And spaced practice, interleaving, elaboration, dual coding, and concrete examples. Now we'll go through them one at a time. So this is retrieval practice. And what is retrieval practice? Well, just like it sounds, it's the act of recalling information. It's going into your own brain and picking it and trying to find that one little thing that you're looking for. Why do we do this? Well, we know that memory researchers have demonstrated that difficult, challenging strategies, such as recalling information, boost long-term memory. So how do we do it? How do you put that in practice? Well, you know, flashcards are great. Practice questions and exams, self-quizzing, all these things are really great for elaborate or retrieval practice. The one thing I'm going to mention is that they all require kind of deliberate engagement. And what I mean by that is that you really need to be, you know, really present in what you're doing. You know, and I'll use flashcards as an example. I always tell my students that to really maximize your use of a flashcard, you want to spend more time in the front end of the card than the back end of the card. And here's what I mean. So if you have a flashcard and it says, what is a histone? And you're looking at it, you're like, man, I don't remember what a histone is. Then a lot of us, what we do, or at least this is what I did, is I would flip and I'd go, oh, it's a protein that DNA wraps around. It's a protein that DNA wraps around. And I would sit there and stare at that back of the card and just will myself to remember that. Well, that's probably not all that useful. Once you see the answer, then you can kind of try to elaborate. And what's actually probably more useful is that if you don't know the card, and you say, what is a histone? You go, do I know anything about this? Well, I remember it has something to do with DNA. And that way, when you do flip it around, you have something to hang the information on that you're trying to learn. So spend more time really thinking about that front side of the card. And then when you do flip it, try to figure out how you can hang the information that you do know on what you didn't know, if that makes sense. All right. So the second learning strategy is, or evidence-based learning practice, is spaced practice. So what is spaced practice? Well, it's a spreading of learning over time so that it's not crammed all at once. And how that looks is it's kind of, you don't cram. The antithesis of spaced practice is what, a lot of college students get in the habit of doing, and that is cramming the night or the weekend before the exam. And so why do we use spaced practice? Well, we know that every time that we access a memory trace, we strengthen that trace, right? And what I don't have on here, but what's also kind of important to do, is the difficulty it is in reaching that trace probably helps the strength of that trace as well. So if you wait a couple days and then try to remember it, it's going to be harder, right? And that little bit of increased difficulty seems to help our learning. So what you want is kind of this regular, you see it and you start to forget it, but before you completely forget it, you see it again. And we call that the forgetting curve. And you don't want to wait so far down the forgetting curve that you've really forgotten it, but you want to have enough forgetting happening that it's kind of hard for you to remember. Okay, and so how you do that? Well, you don't cram, and you plan and organize your study so that you are actively recalling information multiple times. All right, interleaving. So what is interleaving? This one you might not be able to guess just from the name, but interleaving is the switching up of subjects during study. And so why do we do this? Well, changing subject and topics frequently improves the brain's ability to tell apart or discriminate against concepts. And so it kind of allows your brain to compare and contrast. And it helps it decide when things are relevant and when they're not. It also prevents the rote use of concepts and strategies. So, and the other thing that I don't have on here, but at least my work with students, is I think that if you spend too much time doing one thing, your brain kind of gets tired of doing that one thing. And so you start to lose a little bit of your focus. So changing topics often and frequently helps kind of change your gear so you don't get kind of in a rut. So how does this work? Well, it changes, you just change the subject and topics frequently while you're studying. And so, for instance, if you wanted to, this kind of picture down here shows you, you've got topic 1, and you could spend 2 hours studying for topic 1. You could spend 2 hours studying topic 2, and 2 hours studying topic 3, or 2 hours studying topic 4 over different days, or however you have your study sessions. But what might actually be better, instead of spending 2 hours studying topic 1, maybe you spend a half an hour studying each of the topics every single day. And that helps with the spaced repetition throughout your days as well. I will say that sometimes this goes against our intuition too. Sometimes you just feel like it makes you feel better to sit down and just hammer through something until you're completely done. Or you feel like you've accomplished whatever everything is that you're trying to do. But the reality is that, sometimes, as we said, we don't always know what's best for us. And, cognitive research tells us that this spaced and interleaving it works. So you might want to give it a shot. All right, elaboration. What is elaboration? Elaboration is the explaining and describing of ideas with many details, as many details as you can come up with. And why? Well, first, it strengthens your understanding of a given topic. It also helps, like we talked about, it helps you connect different neural pathways. And so it provides different ways to access information. So, you might not be as comfortable with topic B, but maybe you're an expert on topic A. So if you can somehow kind of try to figure out how A and B are related, then you'll be more likely to remember and understand, topic B, or maybe how topic A and B are different. Understanding the differences and similarities, comparing and contrasting, those can really work. So how does this work? Or how do you do this? How do you elaborate with your studies? Well, ask yourself how things work and why. If you're learning some process, then ask deeper questions. Ask yourself, where does this fit into the real world? Where does this fit into my understanding of biology? How does this fit into whatever? Try and connect this idea and topic to the things you've already learned. Also building concept maps. And I'm going to talk a little bit more and give you kind of an example of a concept map in a little bit. But concept maps are really just you trying to put down this area of understanding onto paper in a way that makes sense to you. And we tend to think we're always shown things in bulleted lists and in these kind of organized outlines. And at the beginning of each chapter, at the beginning of the table of contents, and all these things, these are organized outlines, and that's how we're kind of trained to think. But sometimes I'm not convinced that our brain is really meant to look at things that way either. And so thinking outside of outlines and thinking them in terms of concept maps might be something that helps you in areas. And like I said, we'll talk about that in a little bit. All right, so dual coding. So what is dual coding? It's the process of combining verbal materials with visual materials. And why do we do that? Well, when you have the same information in two different formats, you have two ways of remembering that information later on. And we don't exactly completely understand why dual coding works as well as it does. But if you've ever tried to understand a very complicated process, odds are, if the instructor or your tutor or your friend who's trying to explain it to you, they're going to draw you a picture of how it works. And drawing out those pictures and putting an image to what you're thinking can be really helpful. And how do you do that? Well, you can search out your own visuals, or you can search out other people's visuals and explain them in your own words. A Google image search is actually a great way to do this. And I tell my students often that the Google image search is kind of an underrated study tool in a lot of ways. But one of the things that a Google image search does is it tells you how other people see this whatever thing is that you're trying to learn. But your brain also might have a stronger preference for learning whatever you find, because you have to differentiate between all these images and decide which one's relevant for what you are trying to work with. And in that determining what's relevant, your brain kind of determines that that's yours, that's your image, that's the image that you chose. And whenever we choose something, our brain puts a little more emphasis on it, and it makes it more important, and we probably make a thicker memory trace from that. You can also draw your own visuals, and this is obviously a great way to practice. And if you can draw a visual, you can also try to add some retrieval practice by trying to draw these things from memory, right? So maybe the first time you draw something, you have to have some help. You have to look at another figure. The next time you try to draw that visual, try to do it from memory. So that way, not only are you dual coding, but you're also trying to do some of that retrieval practice as well. And finally, concrete examples. What are they? Well, concrete examples are just what they are. They're specific examples for the topic that you're trying to study. Why are they important? Well, it provides relevance to what you're learning. And how do you come up with concrete examples? And this is the one learning strategy that I think is a little tricky, because sometimes finding a concrete example of something is difficult. And so you need to make sure that you are finding the right concrete example, because you don't want to be using the wrong example. So, one of the best ways is to ask your professor for an example. So if you aren't getting something, if you're kind of stuck, ask for a concrete example. Ask them to provide that. You can also try to find an example on your own or through research, through Google. Just be careful that you're applying it correctly, because that can be a little tricky. All right. So now we've talked about these learning tools, and maybe you're going, wow, that's fantastic. And maybe you are thinking, oh, this is how I can change my own personal study patterns, or this is what I can do to change things up and make them, more evidence-based. And maybe some of you are like, okay, that's great. I don't really know what to do now. And in fact, in my experience working with medical students, that I get a variety of those responses. Some people can watch that talk, and what I expected is that students would watch a talk like I just gave, and then they'd go, wow, now I know exactly how to study. And so I was kind of surprised when these medical students, who are obviously all very good, strong students, came back later. And when I'd ask, well, how are you doing your retrieval practice? They kind of looked at me blankly, and I said, well, what about your interleaving? What, are you making sure you're mixing things up, and space practice and all these things? And, some of them obviously had made study plans that had all these things in them. And then other people just like, well, I wasn't quite sure how to do it. And so understand that this is a process that's going to take you time, and you might want to revisit it a lot. This isn't something that just comes intrinsically natural to all students, and that's okay. And we have some evidence actually suggesting why that might be in that, but that's for another talk another day. So what I want to do first is, or what I want to do for you guys now, is kind of talk about a couple different application strategies that might help you. All right, the first tip is let's schedule your spaced repetition. And how does that look? Well, that's where you take your syllabus and you put it into a monthly or weekly calendar. And these are kind of the specifics that what I'm looking for. I'm looking for that you do a pre-reading 2 to 4 days before your lecture. So that way you know what's coming when you get to lecture. It's a lot easier to engage in a lecture and ask good questions, be able to ask for concrete examples. You're able to think about whether it really makes sense to you if you've already seen it once before. Now, most syllabuses will say, okay, this is the reading that goes along with lecture 1. So try to do that 2 to 4 days ahead of your lecture. And that's what this bullet point is. So then the next thing you're going to add for your schedule is you're going to add a quick review for each class. So the night before, maybe the morning before you go to that lecture, you quick look at your notes, or you quick look at something just to remind yourself what you covered, so that it's fresh on your mind for the night for that lecture. Then you're going to go to class, and then after class, 1 to 2 days after you've seen that lecture, now you're going to do like a class consolidation. So now you're going to consolidate what you learned from the textbook or video or whatever the pre-reading or pre-assignment that you had. Then you're going to think about the lecture, and you're going to kind of put those together and make sure they make sense. And you're going to think about, okay, you're going to consolidate all the information that you have on that topic and make sure that everything makes sense. Then finally, you're going to review for the exam, and that's 2 to 3 days for the exam. And if there's a long time between your class and the exam, maybe you want to have another consolidation or review before that, depending on how the schedule looks. So if I had a 2-week planner, and I realize this might be small on your screen and not that readable, but I'll try to walk you through it. So what I've done here is in black here, I have my biochemistry lecture 1 here on Tuesday, my biochemistry lecture 2 in class here, and these are all in black, and then my biochemistry lecture 3 in class lecture is here. And then I have my first biochemistry exam here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do all of my pre-readings. So 2 to 3 days before the lecture. So this is, I don't have a pre-reading on here for lecture 1 because that would be over here somewhere. but we've got our lecture 2, our pre-reading for lecture 2 here. Then we will go to the lecture here. Then we've got our pre-reading lecture 3 here, and it's a couple days before our lecture 3 that's here. And then our pink here is just the quick review, and that should only take 5 to 10 minutes. You're just kind of glossing over what you covered in your pre-reading, and then you go to class. And this could be either the morning of or the night before. And then after the class, so here's lecture 1 again, and here's when you consolidate lecture 1. It's a couple days later. And here's where we consolidate lecture 2. And then before the exam, we do some consolidating and you do some exam review. And so now what this looks like, if you've done this for all of your classes, is now you can kind of see, you know, I don't actually have anything on Friday. Maybe I can do a little bit of my biochemistry exam review on Friday here so that I don't have as much on Wednesday here. But it's also giving you multiple passes for each lecture. And that's really important, right? So if you can schedule it, it's really helpful. Also, at the end of the day, you know exactly what you need to do for this day. And so if you have 3 other classes, you also have their pre-reading and their quick review and those. And so they'll be scattered in throughout here as well. But at the end of the day, you can check this off. Okay, I did this today. Okay, you know, I went to class. That's all I needed to do today. I'm done with that. And you can make sure. And let's say, you know, you didn't have time for this on Thursday. So on Friday, maybe you come back and do that consolidation instead. And then you can check it off on Friday. All right, hopefully that makes sense. So the second tip is reimagining note-taking, and consider doing concept mapping rather than outlining. And here's my example of concept mapping. And if I were to concept map the talk that I just gave today, it might look something like this. And I would have the main points, and then I'd have my take-home messages here. And you can see that this is kind of what my take-home message from today's lecture was. And so when you do your pre-reading, what I'd recommend, let's see, yeah. So now let's think about how to reimagine the note-taking. So maybe you do your pre-reading, and when you're done with that pre-reading, you draw a concept map of what you've learned. Now, when you go to class the next day, you can use that same concept, you can use that same concept map to then review for the class the day before, make sure that it still makes sense. And if you have any questions, like if there are some questions that you didn't understand from the pre-reading, you can have them on the back of your concept map or somewhere. So that way, when you go to lecture, you're ready. Now you can take more notes on your concept map from the lecture. And then when you consolidate the next day, or 2 days later from your lecture, you can then make sure that all those things are making sense. Did you fill those holes? Do you really understand what's going on? And then when you study for your exam, you can try to recreate your concept map. Now, sometimes lectures are too big, and maybe one lecture might be 2 or 3 concept maps, depending on what you covered in. And obviously, you have to kind of iron out how this works for you in the classes that you're taking. Some classes you might have, you know, if you're in biochemistry and you're learning a lot of different biochemical pathways, you might decide that you need a concept map for each of the pathways that you're learning. You know, each one of these, you have to optimize and make it work for you and what you're studying. Finally, my third tip is to utilize your resources. Do lots of questions. If there aren't questions in the back of the book, or in the back of the chapter, look for them elsewhere. Team up with a classmate, ask each other questions, you know, quiz each other, puzzle each other, you know, see what works for you. Group study is a great way to learn. Because you're forced to actually voice out loud your thoughts. You have to be much more concrete about what you know when you have to speak it out loud. And it really helps cement that you have holes in your logic when you have to say it out loud. Group study can be really tricky to navigate, and there's a lot of social dynamics and things that make it a little, there are a lot of more barriers to group study, but it's really a benefit. And I'm also added here that tutors are great for group study. You know, you could easily form like a study group where you meet with someone 2 or 3 times a week, and maybe you have 2 or 3 people in your study group. Maybe one of those times you invite a tutor, and you know, you guys all chip in and pay for a tutor to answer questions for an hour. And you know, a tutor for 3 of you in a 1-hour session is going to be really cheap, right? And then you have an expert right there. Flashcard systems, Anki, which I'm going to talk about in just a few minutes, is also are great. So, you know, there's also Quizlet or cram.com or some of those that actually kind of help you with keeping track of flashcards and keeping up with spaced practice. All right, so here are some resources from today's lecture or talk if you'd like to check them out. This book is amazing. It will change your perspective on learning, almost guaranteed. It's also a fun book to read. It gives a lot of learning examples. It's not just, you know, school learning. It's also, you know, it goes from airline pilots, you know, learning how to not make critical mistakes to how athletes learn. And it's an enjoyable read. It's worth the time. There's this website called thelearningscientist.org, and they have a ton of information for you to explore this on your own. So these 6 evidence-based practices that I talked about, this is where they come from. There's a book that they also have if you're interested. There's flashcard apps, like I said, Anki or Quizlet or cram.com. If you want to go to medical school, then I suggest right now you learn how to use Anki. If you want to study for the MCAT using Anki, I highly, highly, highly recommend adding this to your practice. And I'm happy to talk to students in that regard at any point. Now, I will warn you that Anki is really hard to use. It's hard to get used to. It takes some time. Be ready to spend a lot of time on YouTube, watching YouTube videos. It's a freeware, which is great, but you can customize it 100 different ways, and which makes it a little more complicated to learn how to use. So figure it's going to be a learning curve, but you have to learn it sometime. And you're much better off learning it now as an undergraduate than you are during your first couple weeks of medical school, trust me. All right. There's also this useful study video for a successful medical student. He's much more eloquent than I am, so he's kind of a fun watch, and I've added this as well. All right, are there any questions? And I will, let's see, stop share.
That was great, Shannon. Excellent presentation. There was one question about Anki, and I think that you covered it pretty well at the end. It was about your opinion on whether or not it's a good study tool.
Yep. Yes, it is a good tool, definitely.
If there are, you know, we can hang out here for just a minute in case some folks are formulating questions in their head. That was a lot of great information. And this presentation will also be made available on the event website over the coming week. We'll be getting these up online, so you can always come back to it. And if you qualify for pre-med advising, Dr. Uffenbeck is also one of our pre-med advisors, so you can sneak in a question that way also if you end up having an appointment with her.
You can't avoid it if you have an appointment with me.